everyone. And also, because of the storytelling, which is great to be in the audience, but I am not a storyteller by any stretch of the imagination. The last performance I did was in 4th grade. I fell off the stage into the audience. It's quite dramatic.
That's a good story.
It's a good story, but my mother tells it much better. I landed on her. So I just wanted to explain about the slide. So the images that I've used in the slides are from an animation film that was made in 1937 by 2 German brothers, the Deal brothers, whose work I really love and I've watched for a long time. They're quite eerie. It's an old black and white German film. It's called the Siebenlagen, which is German. My German's very bad. There's a gentleman who speaks German before, which is the 7 ravens, which I'll sort of be talking about. So this paper is really a kind of exploration of some ideas that inform a story I've been trying to write for a long time. It's finally coming together, maybe. But before I came to the story, and before I could actually write it, I had to explore a whole lot of ideas that I'm going to share with you about fairy tales, but particularly about loss and longing and transformation in fairy tales. And maybe even more particularly about silence as an expression of longing in fairy tales, longing for the past and longing for change. So the Grimm brothers, who we've heard a lot about today, just a little more, began the introduction to their first edition of Kindred Halfmarken from 1812 with an introduction that posits the unhappy rupture between oral and literary culture, or oral and literary culture. For them, oral culture, including the fairy tales they collected, a harder and older and better, more natural and more spontaneous world, or a more spontaneous story tradition than that of the contemporary written narratives that they've been reading. Literary fairy tales cannot even exist, according to the Grimms in the introduction, who say explicitly that fairy tales cannot be invented. Their introduction relies on some ideas that persist in contemporary folk and fairy tale scholarship, and in particular 4 kind of themes. One, that fairy tales are or should be for children as the primary or secondary audience, that the best fairy tales are those transcribed directly from oral sources, preferably authentic, uneducated, lower class ones, rather than educated people. That oral tales are a kind of natural but marvellous growth out of authentic folk culture, and that oral storytelling is in drastic decline, and any traces of it must be preserved in print. Can you hear the story? The slides also have the original language because my pronunciation is very bad, so I'm going to read you my translations. Their introduction to Kindred Halfmarken also references Charles Perrault. They say that France must surely have more fairy tales than those given us by Charles Perrault, who alone still treated them as children's tales, not so his inferior imitators, Sulway and Marat. He gives us only 9, which are certainly the best known and also among the most beautiful. This introduction expresses a distrust for literary or written stories that persists throughout the fairy tale scholarship for centuries, right up until the present day, really. And that is inextricably linked with a rather odd configuration of the role of women as storytellers and writers within the fairy tale tradition. I'll do the shorthand angry famous today. The Grimms refer to the female 17th century writers as Schlachterin Nachmacher, as inferior imitators of Perrault, but in fact, to Aulnoy wrote work before Perrault published his tales under the name of his son because he was embarrassed with writing fairy tales. And some of his tales are retellings of other tales that were written mostly by women, such as Marat and Bernard. De Villiers, in his 1699 pamphlet, Dialogues on Fairy Tales and Some Other Works of Our Time to Act as an Antidote Against Bad Taste. It's an excellent title. It's a series of letters that he writes to a woman who wants to educate her daughter, and he's telling her what sort of stories. So Villiers writes quite explicitly that one must be clever to imitate the ignorant simplicity of women. This is quite a convoluted thing. So he denigrates and despises the actual educated, literate women who were writing stories because their tales were often long and intricate, aggressive, playful, self-referential, politically engaged and self-conscious, very different to the blunt terseness that Walter Benjamin and other kind of critics associate with the fairy tale form. The later critic, only slightly later, I like the old stuff better than the new stuff. The later critic Wagner writes in a series of published letters about fairy tales that the old oral tales collected by the Grimms should be preferred over contemporary works by the Conteuses of France because, this is my translation, very bad, these new tales were no longer the stories of bygone days and Mother Goose, repeated endlessly by serving women whose good instincts and even lack of education had taught the turns of phrase that were the simplest, the clearest, the most naive, and the best suited to the feeble intelligence of their pupils. I love this kind of, it's kind of unacknowledged argument going on between men and women and writers and storytellers in the literature. So the Grimm brothers' work then is partly based, and of course they were conscious of this in some ways, on a nostalgic but ultimately futile quest to recover a past that never quite existed, and to adopt a female voice that never exists, to belittle and obscure and actually overwrite actual female voices in preference for male performances of female speech and female writing. There's a lovely book by Susan Stewart called On Longing, in which she writes that nostalgia, like any form of narrative, is always ideological. The past it seeks has never existed except as a narrative or as an idea, and hence is always absent. That past continually threatens to reproduce itself as a felt lack, which is a psychoanalytic term, the way that she was thinking of. And a lack, of course, a felt lack in fairy tales is expressed often as the silence, which is what I'm going to now talk about some thing that their son wrote. This is Herman Grimm in his memoir. Which one was he? Was Jacob's son? He writes about the Grimms. Silence was a real element. I remember how, as a child, I would walk about in the studies and my father, as we children called Jacob. All you could hear was the scratching of their pens, and sometimes Jacob's frequent little coughs. When writing, he bent down close over the paper. The ends of his quills were cut off short, and he wrote quickly over excitement. My father left the goose quills unplucked, and he wrote more deliberately. The facial features of both were in constant motion. Comical. Their eyebrows would move up and down. At times they stared into space. I cannot imagine that anyone would dare interrupt this sacred silence. Silence here is figured as both sacred and literary and productive. It's the silence of scholars, the silence that comes after the chatter of women and the gossipy nature of the story collections. It is also a silence of longing, the silence that recurs again and again in the tales the Grimms collected and in other fairy tales that I'll talk about a little bit later. In her book, translated into English as Patterns of Childhood, the East German writer Christa Wolf refers to fairy tales over and over again and to the Grimm tradition of fairy tales. She's particularly interested in their themes of bodily transformation and to their engagement with notions of silence and nostalgia for an earlier, better Germany. The book is a sort of autobiography, lots of sort of, a biography that's uneasy about the project of biography at all, and the nature of history. In the book, Wolf refers to herself as Nellie and writes in the third person. Occasionally she slips into the second person and refers to herself in the intimate second person, It's a bit like the French intimate second person. Throughout the book she retains a kind of ironic distrust for the narrative of childhood, for sentiment and nostalgia, and for what she calls the tourist trade in half-buried childhoods. The narrator in her text expresses a deep and complex anxiety about the past and its impact on the present, on its refusal to be silent. She writes of, again, it's my very bad translation because I don't like the original translation. She writes, "And the past, which can still prescribe rules governing speech, which can still split the first person into a second and a third, has its supremacy been broken? Will the voices be still? I don't know." This desire to silence the voices of the past is often placed in a productive proximity to stories about how the stories of childhood, fairy tales in particular, provide ways to understand the experiences of the present. At one point in the narrative, for example, Krista Wolf writes about the return of Nellie's father from his long internment in Russian POW camp during the Second World War. He returns quite physically altered, and there's this quite beautiful thank you quote from the book. Again, this might be a bad translation, I apologise. "Strangely enough, Nellie had foreseen it. Fairy tales prepare us for it from childhood on. The hero, the king, the prince, the lover falls under a spell in foreign lands and returns as a stranger." Nellie and Wolf are right, of course, as all of you understand. In fairy tales, all kinds of objects and beings or motifs change shape, not always literally, but by association with one another. This is something Bashalayaga also writes about. I want now to talk about some stories in particular and those various aspects of the tales and the tellers. So about silence and learning and loss. And in particular about ATU tale type 451, which is in the ATU is called Brothers Changed into Birds. And some particular sources of those tales, including the Grimm, who collected several versions of it, and Anderson's much more elaborate, literary, almost feminine story. I'm going to speak about not speaking, which is kind of hard. I'd like to tell you a story, and it should begin once upon a time, because that's how the stories my father told me began. Once upon a time, there was a father who told a story to his child. That began once upon a time, there was a father who told a story to his child. Things could go on like this forever, so I will stop there. Fairy tales are nothing if not endless, and endlessly connected to each other. As Donahue makes explicit in her series of fairy tales, Kissing the Witch, the silence after each story ends and the silences before each story begins are an invitation to tell another story. She writes in Kissing the Witch, "In the morning I asked, 'Who were you?' before you walked into my kitchen. And she said, 'Well, I'll tell you my own story. It is a tale of a bird.'" You had a name once, but I've forgotten it. I had a name once too. You called me Leaford, which was my mother's language, not your language, and I called you Tad, which was your language but not mine. When Leaford was small, Tad told her stories about birds and silence. His stories always began once upon a time and always ended in the German style, with the promise that if the characters are not dead, they are living still. Are you dead now, Tad? Or are you living still? In these stories, there are several brothers and one sister. For one reason or another, the brothers are cursed by a mother, a stepmother, a father, or an old woman in the forest. The curse is to become birds, ravens, usually swans sometimes. In Anderson's version, which is perhaps an inauthentic literary tale, digressive and emotional and descriptive, it's the evil queen, the mother or stepmother, who curses them. She says, "Fly off into the world and fend for yourselves. Fly like great birds without a voice." In myths and fairy tales, the lack of a voice is figured as a kind of death. Birds, too, are often symbols of the dead. They are ghosts who live between worlds. In Anderson's story, the brothers fly off across the ocean to a magical kingdom which is a lot like heaven. It is a deathless, golden place. The day before his death, Tad told this story. He put his wings around Leaford's and cawed like a crow. "Do you know," he whispered, "in your mother's tongue, this is doubly dreadful. When the brothers become ravens, their mother becomes the raven's mother, Mutter, a woman who abuses her children. This is how the truth comes in," he says. "Always sideways, always slant." The only hope the brothers have of returning to the world of the living, or the world of language, is through the sister. She must make and keep a terrible promise. For as many years as she has brothers, so 3, 6, or 7, sometimes 12 even, she must stay silent. version says she must also promise not to smile and not to laugh. And most that during those long years she must keep herself busy making shirts for her brothers. The shirts must be woven from nettles harvested from the graveyard in the city where she lives. The nettles that she harvests will sting her skin, which will blister and itch and fester, but she must not cry. She must not weep. Tard puts his fingers against Liver's lips. Shh. She says, shh. Then he calls loudly in the quiet room. Many fairy tales contain something similar, a promise or a prohibition, and as Sulway says, that we should consider this. In almost all stories of promises and prohibitions, the promises and prohibitions carry with them the inevitability of failure, of their own failure. In the stories that Tard tells Liefert, the sister goes into the graveyard and harvests nettles from the graves of her own dead. The pain is indescribable, but she makes no sound. Then she travels deep into the heart of the forest, where she climbs a tree and begins to sew up the fine white shirts that shall save her brothers. The sister is sitting in a tree when the king passes by. There are lots of kings in Germany. He is hunting, and she is what he hunts. He asks her to come down from the tree, but she refuses. She throws down her belt. She throws down her crown. She throws down her shoes. He is not satisfied. She throws down her dress into her corset, hoping to bribe the king and his men to leave. But they don't leave. In the end, the king climbs up into the tree and takes away the silent princess. Of course, he marries her. Though at the altar she stands silent, she cannot say, I do, or I don't. She refuses to weep, but her face is as white as the shirts she has not yet finished sewing. She bears 3 children. They are all stolen by the king's mother. In one version of the tale, the king's mother smears the mouth of the queen with blood and tells the king that the queen must have eaten her children. But does she speak? Says Tard. Does she defend herself? Liefert opens her mouth, but she has learned this lesson very well. She shakes her head and holds her tongue. No. The sister queen is sentenced to death. She is to be burned at the stake. They pile up the timber. They take her out to the square. They tie her to a post. They light a flame. The brothers arrive, winging in overhead. Oh, Miss Tard. The sister queen has brought the fine white shirts to her burning. She throws them out over her brothers. Her years of silence are almost done, but of course she fails. At the last moment, at the very last moment, she cries out a single word. Or, in other versions, she's failed to stitch a sleeve onto the youngest brother's shirt. He will forever have one wing. Tard shakes his head. The next morning, when the Ravensmutter leaves the house, he will take Liefert into the kitchen. He will open the stove and turn on the gas. Gas is something that we know about in my family. He will pull his daughter onto his lap and tell the story again, a little differently this time. In this version, it is the father who becomes the dead and flies away silently. And it is his daughter, his Liefert, who must hold her tongue, who must lie quietly while the gas fills the room, who must not cry, who must not make a sound, while the house grows still and Tard grows weary. They will fly away soon to the land of Fae, to the Golden Island. 7 days later, Tard passes away. He flies from the window of a hospital in Sydney. His body is buried in a walled rose garden. This too is something out of a fairy tale, a place the Ravensmutter warns they will never visit. A great beast stalks the garden, gnawing on the bones of the dead. Liefert and the Ravensmutter go to live in a tall building with windows facing out to sea, not a tower, not a tree. There are no graveyards from which to harvest nettles, but Liefert knows the promise she must keep. She holds her tongue. She does not cry. She does not smile. The Ravensmutter takes her to see the witch in the glass window cave. There are books and toys, and the witch kneels on the carpet. They play with the dollhouse and the dolls. At night, the Ravensmutter comes into Liefert's room. Speak, the Ravensmutter says. She sticks her fingers in the child's mouth and plucks at her tongue and cries herself, why won't you speak? Leafed light in bed, she listens to the wind. Unspeakable fairy tales ebb like flowing through her head, and she is listening for the sound of the birds.
Unfortunately, one special question. Who has a special question?
They're not good.